The morning Rachel Merritt signed that contract, she was smiling. Not the smile of someone who had concluded a fair negotiation. Not the smile of someone who had walked away with something valuable. The smile of someone who had finally found exactly the right place to put a knife and had used it cleanly, without hesitation, without regret. She stood in the gravel lot of a crumbling garage on the edge of Millfield, Ohio. Her cream-colored wool coat cost $4,000. The building she was selling cost $500. She signed her name across the bottom of the one-page agreement without reading a single line of it. She did not need to read it. She had written the terms herself. $500. Not because the garage was worth $500. Not because she needed $500. But because she had spent 6 years married to Daniel Merritt. 6 years watching him drive 90 minutes every other weekend to stand inside that crumbling building and look at things covered in canvas. And she understood, with the precision of a woman who had studied her husband carefully, that this building was the one thing that still connected him to his father. And $500 was the most insulting number she could think of. She handed the pen back to the buyer. A quiet man, gray work jacket, arrived alone, said very little. Agreed to her price without negotiating. Did not even ask what was inside. Rachel turned to her attorney and said, loud enough to carry across the gravel lot. Loud enough that the buyer could hear it if he was paying attention. Make sure the deed transfers before he finds out. She walked back to her car. She did not look at the building again. She had no reason to. She was finished with it. What Rachel Merritt did not know, what nobody standing in that cold gravel lot on that February morning knew, was that inside that crumbling building, arranged in 2 careful rows beneath layers of canvas and 11 years of deliberate silence, was a collection of automobiles that represented the single most significant private automotive holding in the state of Ohio. 8 cars, each one sourced, acquired, and restored by a man who understood value the way most people understand language. Naturally, completely, and without needing to be taught. A 1966 Shelby GT350 fastback, restored to factory specification, worth $1.2 million. A 1969 Dodge Charger R/T, numbers matching, worth $380,000. A 1957 Ferrari 250 Testa Rossa, one of 19 confirmed examples in existence, worth $18 million. A 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, one of 36 ever built. The car that serious collectors discussed in lowered voices, worth $22 million. For additional vehicles beneath the remaining tarps, each one worth between $180,000 and $600,000. Total conservative estimate, assessed privately 18 months before the divorce proceedings began, $42,700,000. She had sold it for $500, and she had not looked back once. Daniel Merritt was 43 years old and had the kind of face that people forgot until they needed something fixed, and then remembered immediately. He was not a man who entered rooms loudly. He did not tell stories about himself. He did not explain his decisions to people who had not asked for an explanation. He had grown up in Millfield, Ohio, a town that had never been wealthy and had never pretended otherwise, in a house on Carpenter Street, 3 blocks from the garage, in a family where money was counted carefully and spent more carefully still. His father, George Merritt, had come to Millfield in 1961 with a toolbox his own father had left him, $800 in savings, and a particular quality of attention that the people who knew him described, in the years after he was gone, as the thing they remembered most. George Merritt had opened the garage on the corner of Franklin and 3rd in 1962. Not as an investment, not as a path to something larger, as a place where a man could do honest work and teach his son what honest work felt like from the inside. Daniel had spent every Saturday of his childhood in that garage, not playing, not watching, working. He had learned from his father that an engine was not a machine to be controlled, but a system to be understood. That the difference between a mechanic who fixed things and a mechanic who understood things was the same as the difference between someone who could repeat a sentence in a foreign language and someone who could think in it. George had a phrase he used. He said it to Daniel the first time when Daniel was 7 years old, standing on an overturned milk crate to see over the hood of a 1966 Shelby GT350 that a customer had brought in as scrap, a car so corroded and neglected that 2 other shops had already refused it. George crouched down beside the engine. He ran his hand along the block with the particular attention of someone reading a document they know is important. Then he stood up. He looked at the car. He said, "The rust is just weather, son. The bones underneath don't lie." Daniel had never forgotten it. By the time he was 17, he could diagnose an engine fault by sound alone. Not guessing, not approximating, but identifying with the precision of someone who had spent enough time listening that the sounds had become a language he understood fluently. By 19, he was rebuilding transmissions from component parts. By 22, he had earned an engineering degree in automotive system from Ohio State, graduating near the top of his class, and had accepted a position with Vantage Auto Holdings, a mid-sized firm with a reputation for serious restoration work, the kind that required both academic precision and the instincts that could not be taught in any classroom. He had spent 7 years at Vantage. He was not the loudest person in any room he occupied. He was frequently the most accurate one. He built, quietly and without announcement, a reputation as the person you call when something seemed impossible to recover. 8 months before the story truly begins, Vantage Auto Holdings finalized a corporate merger. The acquiring company had no interest in the restoration division. 14 people received their notifications by email on a Friday evening at 11:17. Daniel read his on his phone, sitting at the kitchen table of a rented apartment that barely accommodated his tools and a bed. He did not reply. He closed the phone. He sat in the dark for a while. Then he went to sleep. The next morning, he started making a list. The marriage he had met Rachel at a charity auction in Columbus when he was 31. She was sharp and beautiful and moved through rooms with the effortless authority of someone who had always been the most interesting person in them. He fell in love with her the way certain quiet men fall in love, completely, and without adequate preparation for what comes next. They married within a year. For a while it was good. Rachel was not cruel in the way that people who enjoy cruelty are cruel. She was ambitious, which is a different thing, but ambition without direction has a way, over time, of becoming something harder to name. She wanted a life that looked a specific way. A house in the right neighborhood. The right social events. The right people. Daniel wanted to work. The garage in Millfield, George's garage, left to Daniel in the will when George died quietly at his workbench in 2019, hands still carrying the oil of 50 years of honest labor, was not part of the life Rachel had designed. She had asked him to sell it twice in the first year of their marriage. He had said no both times. Not loudly. Not with argument or extended explanation. Just no. In the steady way a man says no to something that was never actually negotiable. She had not forgiven him for that. The marriage lasted 6 years. The divorce took 14 months. At the end of it, Daniel had his tools, his truck, his daughter Lily, a custody arrangement that gave him every other week and alternating holidays, and a single critical error in the asset division paperwork that would take more than 2 years to fully resolve. The garage. His attorney had advised him that property inherited before the marriage was likely protected. Likely. One line on one tax return, a clerical error from 2021 in which the garage address had been listed under marital property improvements, had been enough. The court ruled it subject to division. Rachel did not want the garage. She wanted Daniel to know she could take it. The 11 years what Rachel's attorney had cataloged during the asset division process was a crumbling commercial structure in Millfield, Ohio. 900 square feet. Corrugated metal roof with visible deterioration. Electrical system non-functional. Assessed value by the county, $11,000. Her attorney had walked through it once. In November, on a gray afternoon when the light was poor and the interior was dark and cold. He had noted the concrete floor, the rusted shelving along the north wall, the old workbench, the large shapes along the back and side walls, covered in canvas tarps. He had not looked under the tarps. Daniel had begun collecting 11 years earlier. It had started with a phone call from a property executor in rural Kentucky who had 3 vehicles in a collapsed barn on a deceased client's estate and needed them removed within 30 days or they would be crushed. Daniel had driven down alone. He had looked at the 3 cars in the beam of his flashlight. He had felt the particular stillness that came over him when he was in the presence of something the world had forgotten but had not yet destroyed. He had paid the estate $4,000 for all 3. He had brought them to Millfield on a rented flatbed. He had covered them with canvas tarps. He had locked the garage. He had told no one. Over the 11 years that followed, he had added to the collection the way a careful man adds to anything he values, deliberately, selectively, only when he was certain. He was not collecting for speculation. He was not gambling on market movements. He was a man who understood, with the same precision he brought to everything else, exactly what certain objects were worth, and exactly how consistently the world failed to recognize that worth until it was too late. He kept records in a leather notebook in the locked drawer of the garage workbench. Vehicle by vehicle. Purchase price. Provenance documentation. Restoration notes. Current market assessment. The notebook told the story in numbers. But the story was not about numbers. The story was about a man who had watched his father run his hands along a corroded Shelby and see not what it was, but what it had always been underneath, and who had spent 11 years doing the same thing. Quietly, without explaining himself to anyone. The buyer's name was Thomas Hale. He was 61 years old, retired municipal engineer. He had moved to Millfield from Columbus 2 years earlier to be closer to his daughter's family after his wife passed. He had found a listing on a local property site on a Tuesday morning. Garage structure, as is sale, motivated seller. He had driven out on a Saturday. He had been thinking about woodworking. He had looked at the exterior of the building from his car for approximately 4 minutes. Then he had called the number on the sign. The listing was handled by a junior associate at Rachel's attorney's firm, a young woman named Caroline who spoke quickly and had already mentally moved on to her next task before Thomas had finished his first sentence. She told him the price. He asked if he could see the inside. She said she would arrange it. The viewing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Rachel did not attend. She sent Caroline. Thomas walked through the building with a small flashlight because the electrical system was non-functional and spent 12 minutes inside while Caroline waited near the door in her good coat and said nothing. Thomas noted the concrete floor, which was sound. He noted the roof, which had a visible sag at the eastern corner but was structurally present. He noted the covered shapes along the walls. He noted that the shapes were large. He did not ask what was under them. Caroline did not volunteer the information. He came back outside. He asked one question. How much? Caroline said, $500. Full waiver of liability. Relocation clause. You need to vacate within 18 months if the broader redevelopment project receives formal approval. Thomas agreed without negotiating. He signed the contract the following Monday morning at a folding table set up near the gate, with the wind cutting across the lot and the sky the color of old concrete. Rachel was not present for the signing. She received the executed documents by email at 2:14 in the afternoon. She read the confirmation once. She forwarded it to her contact list with a 2-word note. Done. Finally, what Thomas found. Thomas returned to the garage on a Wednesday morning. His second visit, the first as the owner. He came with a heavy flashlight, a measuring tape, and a notebook in which he had already sketched a rough plan for the shelving he intended to install along the north wall. He unlocked the side entrance. The roll-up door was still seized and stepped inside. He turned on the flashlight. He stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Then he began measuring the north wall. He got as far as the first covered shape before he stopped. The shape was too deliberate, too careful, not debris arranged against a wall. Something placed, something covered with intention. He reached out and took hold of the corner of the canvas. He pulled it back slowly. The 1966 Shelby GT350 fastback stood in the beam of his flashlight like something from a different world. Deep metallic blue, the chrome trim catching the light, the glass intact, the tires soft from years of stillness but otherwise present. Thomas was not an automotive specialist, but he was not a careless man. He stood in front of the Shelby for a long moment without moving. Then he reached out and touched the hood very lightly with 2 fingers. He pulled the second tarp, then the third. By the time he reached the 4th canvas, The one covering the car at the far rear corner of the garage, the one that sat lower to the ground and wider through the body than any of the others. His hands were not entirely steady. He crouched down and looked at the badge from a low angle. He read it twice. He stood up. He looked at it again from a standing position. He took out his phone. He called his son-in-law. Marcus had spent 15 years in automotive insurance. He knew what the badge meant. He arrived at the garage 48 minutes later. He walked through the building without speaking. He stopped at the red car in the back corner. He crouched down. He looked at the badge. He stood up. He turned to Thomas. He said, "Do you know what this is?" Thomas said he did not. Marcus said, "This is a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO. There are 36 of them in the world. The last one that sold at public auction sold for $70 million. Thomas looked at the car. He looked at Marcus. He said, "I paid $500 for this building." Marcus sat down on an overturned milk crate. He said nothing for approximately 90 seconds. Then he said, "We need to call someone, not a dealer, someone who understands what this actually is." Daniel Merritt had been driving to Millfield every other Saturday since the divorce proceedings began, not to confront anyone, not to monitor the situation, simply because the garage was the place where he thought most clearly, and the months of legal proceedings had given him a great deal to think through. He would park on the far side of the street. He would sit in the truck for a few minutes. He would look at the building. He would think about his father. Then he would drive back to Columbus. He had not been inside since the court ruling. On the Saturday morning that Thomas Hale and Marcus were standing in the garage, surrounded by 8 uncovered automobiles, discussing phone calls and specialists and numbers that neither of them had any prior framework for processing, Daniel pulled his gray pickup truck into the road that ran along the eastern edge of the property. He stopped. There was a vehicle he did not recognize parked at the gate. The side door was open. Daniel sat in the truck for a moment. He was not alarmed. He was not angry. He was a man looking at a fact that had just changed, assessing what it meant and what, if anything, needed to be done about it. He got out of the truck. He walked to the side door. He stepped inside. 2 men were standing in the center aisle of the garage. The older one was on the phone. The younger one was standing in front of the canvas that had covered the 250 GTO. The canvas had been pulled back to waist height. The car was partially visible. Daniel stood in the doorway. The older man turned and saw him. He lowered his phone. There was a silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained, for each of the 3 men, a completely different set of calculations. Thomas said, "Are you the one who used to own this building?" Daniel looked at the car. He looked at Thomas. He said, "My name is Daniel Merritt, and I need to make a phone call." Patricia Voss. The call was to his attorney. Patricia Voss had spent 22 years in property and asset litigation. She had a particular quality, common among people who had spent long enough dealing with situations that other people considered extraordinary, of being genuinely difficult to surprise. Daniel explained the situation in 4 sentences. She was quiet. Then she said, "The vehicles were separately documented before the marriage?" "Yes." "Independent valuation on file?" "Yes." "And the court order covered the structure, the garage building, not the contents?" Daniel said, "The attorney who walked through it never asked what was under the tarps." Patricia Voss said, "Daniel, do not move anything. Do not have any substantive conversation with those men beyond what courtesy requires. I will be there in 90 minutes. She was there in 75. She reviewed the court order in the gravel lot, standing beside her car with the documents on the hood and the February wind moving across the lot. She reviewed the independent valuation report, the private assessment commissioned 18 months before the divorce proceedings began, conducted by a specialist in historic automotive assets, documenting each vehicle's provenance, condition, and current market value with the precision of a legal instrument, because that is exactly what Daniel had intended it to be. She reviewed the purchase records, each vehicle acquired before the marriage, each one documented, each one traceable to Daniel Merritt, personally, through a chain of custody that predated any legal connection to Rachel by a minimum of 5 years. She looked up. She said, "The court awarded Rachel the structure. The structure is a building. What was inside it was never listed in the marital asset schedule because it was never identified as a marital asset, correctly, as it turns out, because it was not one. The buyer purchased the building. He purchased the walls and the roof and the concrete floor. He did not purchase the contents. The contents belonged to you. Thomas Hale, to his considerable credit, did not dispute this. He was a retired engineer who had spent 32 years working with legal documents. He read the provenance paperwork on a 1957 Ferrari Testa Rossa, the full chain of title, running from a private estate in northern Italy through a licensed American importer to Daniel Merritt, signed and notarized, predating the marriage by 6 years. And he read it carefully, the way he had always read documents that mattered. He folded it. He handed it back to Daniel. He said, "I bought a building. I understand that." He paused. "I would like to buy one of the cars, though. Properly. When you're ready." Daniel looked at him for a moment. "The Dodge Charger," he said. "It suits you. We'll talk." Rachel Merritt learned what had been inside the garage on a Tuesday, 11 days after the transfer of deed. She learned it from her attorney, who had received a formal legal notification from Patricia Voss's office that morning. A document, precise and unhurried in its language, that outlined the removal of privately owned automotive assets from the Millfield garage structure pursuant to established premarital provenance documentation. The notification listed the assets, vehicle by vehicle, with current market valuations. Her attorney described the phone call later, to a colleague, as one of the quieter 3 minutes of his professional career. Rachel did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She sat on the other end of the line and said nothing for a very long time. Then she said, he knew. Her attorney said the assets had been legally his throughout. The 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO sold 14 months after that to a private collector in Switzerland who had been searching for an example of this specific production run for 11 years. $22 million. The sale generated a brief note in 2 automotive publications and no coverage anywhere else, because Daniel had stipulated, as a condition of both sales, that his name would not appear in any associated press materials. He did not want coverage. He did not want recognition. He had never wanted either of those things. The remaining vehicles were transferred to the Merritt Restoration Facility, the converted garage on Franklin and 3rd, now fully operational, now bearing a small brass plaque beside the door that read, Merritt Garage, ST 1962. George Merritt, founder. Daniel had arranged for the plaque to be installed on a Tuesday afternoon. He had not told anyone. He had gone back to work. What Lily asked Lily Merritt was 8 years old and asked questions the way certain children ask questions, not to fill silence, but because she actually wanted to know. She asked her father, on a Wednesday evening in the diner on 5th Street where they always went, why he had never argued with her mother about the garage. She had heard things. Children hear things. Daniel put down his coffee. He thought about the question in the real way, not looking for the answer that would be easiest to give, but for the one that was actually true. He said, "Your grandfather used to tell me that the rust is just weather, but the bones underneath don't lie." Lily was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean?" Daniel looked at his daughter. "It means that what something is worth doesn't change because someone decides not to see it. It just waits." Lily considered this. "Is that what you did? You waited?" "Yes." She looked at her pancakes. Then she looked up. "Is that why you kept the Shelby?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment. The Shelby GT350, his father's car, the car George had called beautiful beneath the rust, the first car Daniel had ever looked at with the understanding that what he was seeing was not the surface, but the structure underneath, sat in Bay, one of the Merritt Restoration Facility, fully restored, bearing a small card on the dashboard in George's handwriting. "The rust is just weather. The bones underneath don't lie." He was not going to sell it. He had never been going to sell it. "Yes," he said. Lily nodded once, the nod of a child who has received an answer that satisfies her completely. She went back to her pancakes. Daniel picked up his coffee. Outside the window of the diner, Millfield moved through its ordinary Wednesday evening. Inside, a father and his daughter sat across from each other in a vinyl booth, and neither of them needed to say anything more. Because some things, once understood, do not require more words. They only require the people who understand them to keep showing up. And Daniel Merritt had always been very good at that. 6 months later, Rachel Merritt saw the press release for the Merritt Restoration Facility in a regional business publication. She was at her desk when it came across her feed. The photograph showed the exterior of the garage, fully renovated now, the corrugated roof replaced, the brick cleaned and repointed, the original roll-up door restored to working order and standing open. The brass plaque was visible in the photograph. George Merritt's name in the light. There was a brief article. Founding of a private restoration facility. Specialist focus on historic American and European automotive assets. No mention of the collection. No mention of the sales. No mention of $42 million. No mention of 500. Rachel read the article once. She looked at the photograph of the garage for a long time. Then she closed the screen. She went back to work. She did not think about it for the rest of the day. Or so she told herself. On a Saturday in early spring, a Saturday that belonged to Daniel, Lily sat on an overturned milk crate in Bay 1 of the Merritt Restoration Facility. She was 8 years old. She had brought her notebook. Daniel was at the workbench, working through the morning checklist for the 1969 Charger that Thomas Hale had purchased 3 months earlier and brought in for a full service. Thomas had kept his word, and so had Daniel. Lily was looking at the Shelby. After a while she said, "Dad, yes. Can I learn to work on it?" Daniel looked at the Shelby. He looked at his daughter. He thought about a 7-year-old boy standing on an overturned milk crate to see over a hood. He thought about a man with weathered hands running his fingers along a corroded engine block and seeing not what it was but what it had always been. He picked up a small wrench from the bench. He held it out to Lily. She took it with both hands. "We'll start today," he said. And they did.